She is not eating. She has not eaten since Tuesday, and today is Friday. And the studio's afternoon light is pouring through Venetian blinds in perfect golden stripes across the linoleum floor, and she looks extraordinary. She looks the way the camera demands she look. She looks the way a contract demands she look. She looks, in other words, nothing at all like a person who is hungry, because hunger, real hunger, the kind that hums in the back of your skull and turns your hands cold, has no place on screen. Her name does not matter for these first few moments. She could be any one of them, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, if you count the contract players who never made it past the second reel, the chorus girls who outlasted 3 musicals before their hips widened a quarter of an inch, and the studio dropped their option without ceremony. She is mid-century Hollywood, and mid-century Hollywood is a machine that runs on beauty and on the quiet, systematic destruction of the bodies that produce it. Outside, the billboards on Sunset Boulevard are already being changed. Her face, or someone's face, is going up in 20-foot glory above the traffic and the palm trees and the tourists craning their necks from open-top buses. The face on the billboard is perfect. The face in the dressing room mirror has dark hollows under the eyes that the makeup artist will have to address with 3 different shades of concealer before the camera rolls at 9. This is the Starvation Equation. Input beauty, output beauty. Erase everything that happens in between. The story of Hollywood's relationship with the female body is long and frequently told, but usually from the perspective of the glamour, the gowns, the photographers. The magazine spreads where women in pearls and satin gowns reclined on chaises and appeared to have been sculpted rather than born. What is told far less often is what it cost, not in dollars, in tissue, in bone mass, in the peculiar and sometimes lethal ingenuity of the methods deployed to keep those bodies camera-ready year after year, decade after decade, through the great golden machine of the studio system and beyond. We are going to examine the diet fads, the pharmaceutical interventions, the medically sanctioned starvation protocols, the bizarre folk remedies, the outright frauds, and the systemic pressures of mid-century Hollywood that produce some of the most dangerous and strange weight loss practices in the history of Western culture. We will meet the doctors who prescribed amphetamines as casually as aspirin, the studio fixers who kept the pills flowing and the actresses compliant, the gossip columnists who policed weight with the precision and cruelty of drill sergeants, the women themselves, some of whom spoke about what was done to them, and some of whom took the truth of it quietly to their graves. We will look at the tapeworm pills, the liquid diets, the cigarette as appetite suppressant campaigns funded by tobacco companies and endorsed by physicians, the cotton balls soaked in orange juice, the sleeping cures, the grapefruit protocols, the benzodrine and dexedrine and phenobarbital and all the other substances poured into famous bodies in the service of a silhouette. Because the Starvation Equation is not just a Hollywood story. It is a story about what a culture decides a woman's body is for, about the precise mechanisms, pharmaceutical, institutional, social, economic, that enforce that decision, about the cheerful malice of an industry that made beautiful women famous and then spent decades quietly destroying them from the inside. This is the Starvation Equation. Let us begin at the beginning, which is, as with most things in Hollywood, not a story about art, but about money. The phrase entered common usage sometime in the late 1920s, when the new medium of synchronized sound film was changing everything about how movies were made and how audiences experienced them. But the phenomenon it described had been quietly tormenting actresses since the earliest days of silent cinema. The camera, it was said, adds 10 pounds. The lens flattens depth, compresses dimensions, and renders the human body in a way that emphasizes mass and diminishes height. An actress who looked perfectly proportioned in person could appear soft, heavy, or even bloated on screen. An actress who looked gaunt enough to alarm a physician in person looked, through the lens, merely slender. This was not a myth. It was a technical reality with profound and lasting consequences for the bodies of every woman who worked in front of a camera during the mid-century studio era. The major studios, MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, RKO, Columbia, Universal, understood this fact as a production problem requiring a production solution. If the camera added weight to the visual image, then the bodies being photographed had to weigh less. The calculation was not complicated. It was not humane. It was efficient in the way that all industrial calculations are efficient. It identified the variable that could most readily be manipulated and applied maximum pressure to it. That variable was the actress. The systems by which the studios managed the bodies of their female contract players were varied, overlapping, and frequently coercive. Some were embedded in the contracts themselves, some were enforced through the studio medical staff, some operated informally through the social pressure of the commissary table, the wardrobe fitting room, the weekly weigh-in that several major studios imposed on their female talent throughout the 1930s and 1940s. The weekly weigh-in was perhaps the most naked expression of industrial body management. Contract players at MGM, to take only the most documented example, were regularly weighed and measured by the studio doctor or nurse, and the results were filed with the studio. Any weight gain above a studio-determined acceptable threshold triggered a response. That response might be a memo to the actress's agent. It might be a direct conversation with the studio physician, who would prescribe a corrective diet, or, increasingly as the decade turned, a corrective pharmaceutical regimen. It might be a note from Louis B. Mayer himself, delivered through intermediaries, informing an actress that her figure was not in keeping with her contractual obligations. This was not unusual. This was standard practice. The contracts themselves frequently contained what were euphemistically called morality clauses and personal appearance clauses, provisions giving the studio broad latitude to discipline or terminate an actress who failed to maintain the appearance standard the studio had hired her to project. Weight gain was explicitly or implicitly covered under these clauses at most major studios. An actress who put on 15 pounds risked having her option dropped, her suspension imposed, or her loan out denied, all of which translated directly to lost income and career damage. The financial incentive was total. A studio had invested in a contract player, in her training, her wardrobe tests, her publicity photographs, her carefully manufactured biography. She was not merely an employee, she was an asset, and assets required maintenance. The fact that the maintenance required was the systematic management of a human woman's relationship to food was, within the studio system's logic, simply not relevant. The camera required a body of certain dimensions. The body would be brought into compliance with those dimensions. The methods were the studio's prerogative. What those methods were varied considerably over time. In the earliest period of the sound era, the primary tool was dietary restriction, often severe, frequently unsupervised, and almost always implemented without the kind of nutritional knowledge that would have made it merely punishing rather than actively dangerous. Studio doctors prescribed diets that were, by the standards of even the medicine of the time, extraordinarily low in calories. 800 calories per day was considered a reasonable maintenance diet for an actress in active production. 500-calorie diets were not uncommon for actresses required to lose weight quickly before a role. For context, 500 calories per day is roughly the caloric equivalent of 2 small apples and a cup of yogurt. For a woman working 12 to 14-hour days on a physically demanding production, learning choreography, performing takes, doing wardrobe fittings, sitting through makeup application, attending publicity events, 500 calories per day represents a level of caloric deficit that modern nutritional science would classify as medically dangerous. The body, starved of fuel, begins to consume itself. Muscle mass degrades, bone density decreases, hormonal cycles become irregular or cease entirely, cognitive function suffers, the immune system weakens. None of this showed up as a concern in the studio doctor's files. What showed up was the actress's weight, measured weekly compared to her target weight, and evaluated against her filming schedule. The actresses themselves had remarkably little recourse. The studio system operated on a star-making logic that most of them had bought into, willingly or not. You could not be famous without the studio. You could not make films without the studio. The studio decided what you ate, who you were seen with in public, what name appeared above the title. The weigh-in was simply one more mechanism of a total institutional control that had already claimed so much, and so they ate what they were told to eat. Or they did not eat at all, which was also frequently what they were told to do. And into this system of structured deprivation, the pharmaceutical industry arrived with an answer that seemed, in the mid-century moment, almost miraculous. It was called amphetamine, and it was about to change everything. Benzedrine was introduced to the American market in 1934 as an over-the-counter nasal decongestant, a small cardboard inhaler containing a paper strip soaked in amphetamine sulfate. Within 3 years, it was being used by college students to stay awake for exams, by truck drivers to cover impossible mileages, by soldiers in wartime for sustained alertness, and by Hollywood actresses to suppress their appetites, elevate their energy, and maintain the relentless physical performance that the studio system demanded of them. The medical establishment of the 1930s and 1940s did not merely permit this, it enthusiastically endorsed it. Between 1935 and 1960, amphetamine and its derivatives, dexedrine, methedrine, phenmetrazine, and dozens of proprietary branded compounds, were prescribed by American physicians for weight loss at a scale that is now almost impossible to fully comprehend. By 1958, it was estimated that American doctors were writing approximately 80,000 amphetamine prescriptions per week. This was not a black market phenomenon. This was mainstream medicine. This was what the doctor ordered. The pills came in cheerful little bottles with pharmacy labels. Mothers took them, housewives took them, socialites took them, and actresses, who had more structural incentive than almost any other population to be thin, and access to studio physicians whose primary loyalty was to the studio rather than the patient, took them in enormous quantities. The mechanism was understood even then, at a basic level. Amphetamines suppress appetite by increasing the release of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, creating a sustained state of heightened alertness and physical energy while dramatically reducing the desire to eat. An actress on a standard dexedrine prescription could work a 14-hour day on a few hundred calories and feel, at least for some portion of that day, energized rather than depleted. She might feel, in fact, extraordinary, sharp, focused, capable, invincible. This was the trap, and it was sprung on some of the most famous women in the world. The studio system's relationship with amphetamines operated through a largely informal network of what were colloquially known as Dr. Feelgoods, physicians retained by studios or patronized by studio management who understood their primary function was not patient care in the traditional sense. Their function was maintenance. They kept the talent functional, thin, and available. They prescribed amphetamines for weight loss, barbiturates to counteract the sleeplessness the amphetamines caused, and more amphetamines to counteract the sedative hangover of the barbiturates. This cycle, uppers in the morning, downers at night, uppers again, became the pharmacological rhythm of an entire generation of Hollywood contract players. The most documented case, because she eventually spoke about it with extraordinary candour, was Judy Garland. Garland began working for MGM as a child, and MGM began managing her weight as a child. She was 13 when the studio began telling her she was too heavy. She was not yet 15 when the studio physician first prescribed her amphetamines, combined, as was standard practice, with phenobarbital to manage the resulting insomnia. The pills were presented to her and to her mother as completely routine medical management, prescribed by a studio doctor in a studio facility, dispensed as casually as vitamins. She would take some version of those pills, in escalating quantities, for the rest of her life. Garland's case is the most famous, but it was far from unique. Studio records, physician memoirs, and the later testimony of actresses who survived the system describe a pharmaceutical landscape that was pervasive and largely invisible precisely because it was medically sanctioned. The pills came from real doctors. The prescriptions were written on real prescription pads. The pharmacies that filled them were licensed. There was no underground here, no criminal infrastructure to identify and prosecute. The whole apparatus was operating in plain sight, with the full endorsement of the medical profession. The pharmaceutical companies knew exactly who their market was. Advertisements for amphetamine-based diet products in medical journals throughout the 1940s and 1950s featured imagery of overweight women as patients in need of correction, and implied that any physician who did not prescribe the product was failing his patient. The framing was explicitly medical. Obesity was a disease, amphetamine was the cure, the physician was the instrument of that cure. That the obesity being treated often involved a weight difference of 10 or 15 pounds from a studio-mandated ideal, rather than any clinically meaningful health threshold, was not a distinction the advertising made. The women who were taking these pills were not in most cases medically obese. They were simply not thin enough for the camera, and for the camera, as far as their studios were concerned, there was a pharmaceutical solution. The long-term consequences of this pharmaceutical regime were severe and well documented, though they were not well documented at the time they were occurring. Chronic amphetamine use produces, among other effects, severe malnutrition from sustained appetite suppression, dental deterioration from the drug's tendency to cause dry mouth and teeth grinding, cardiovascular damage from sustained elevated heart rate, profound psychological dependency, and a withdrawal profile that many users described as among the most physically and emotionally devastating experiences of their lives. Several actresses of this generation died young, of causes that, while rarely attributed to amphetamine use in contemporary obituaries, were almost certainly connected to it. Heart failure, liver failure, the general systemic collapse of a body that had been running on pharmaceutical stimulation and minimal nutrition for decades. The Starvation Equation had its own particular arithmetic, and the numbers, in the end, always came out the same way. But amphetamines were only one chapter of a much stranger pharmaceutical story. Alongside the uppers and downers, the studio era also produced some of the most creative, bizarre, and genuinely dangerous dietary inventions in the history of human ingenuity. Some of them involved weight loss devices that would today be classified as medical fraud. Some of them involved substances that are now recognized as outright poisons. And some of them involved parasites, the tapeworm pill. Of all the diet frauds of the mid-century era, this is the one that has attached itself most tenaciously to the public imagination, the one that gets cited as the ultimate symbol of Hollywood's willingness to do absolutely anything in the service of a slimmer silhouette. The narrative is seductive in its horror. Desperate women, driven by industry pressure, voluntarily swallowing parasites in order to lose weight. The image is so grotesque, so viscerally wrong, that it has the quality of legend, and like most legends, its relationship to documented historical fact is complicated. Here is what is true. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, patent medicine companies sold pills marketed as containing sanitized tapeworm eggs, with the implication that the purchaser would swallow a parasite that would consume a portion of what they ate, resulting in weight loss. Advertisements for these products were printed in mainstream American newspapers and women's magazines as late as the 1920s. They existed. They were sold. They were purchased. Here is what is more complicated. Most historians who have examined the actual patent medicine products sold under these names conclude that the pills did not, in fact, contain viable tapeworm eggs. The science of the era would have made keeping living helminth eggs viable in a pressed pill form extremely difficult. What the pills most likely contained was a combination of laxative compounds, the weight loss effect achieved not through parasitism, but through the rather more prosaic mechanism of intestinal purging. The tapeworm was, in the most literal sense, a marketing hook. This distinction mattered very little to the women purchasing the pills, who were presumably not performing laboratory analysis on their purchases. They were told the pills contained tapeworm eggs. They believed the pills contained tapeworm eggs. Whether the actual product matched the advertisement's extravagant biological claims was a detail the manufacturer had little incentive to resolve. What is genuinely well documented is that the broader category of patent medicine diet products, most of which relied on some combination of diuretics, laxatives, thyroid extracts, or stimulants, was enormously prevalent in the 1930s and 1940s, and that Hollywood was among the most enthusiastic markets for such products. The celebrity endorsement of weight loss products was already well established by the 1930s. Actresses who were photographed thin were commercial assets to any company selling thinness-related products, and the alignment of studio publicity with patent medicine advertising was a natural commercial relationship. But the tapeworm pill exists in a specific Hollywood context for a reason that goes beyond mere historical prevalence. It became, through rumour and gossip and the kind of story that actresses told each other in dressing rooms and at parties and over studio commissary tables, a symbol of how far the system would push you. Whether any particular actress had actually taken a tapeworm pill was almost beside the point. The point was that in a system that prescribed amphetamines to 13-year-olds and put actresses on 500-calorie diets and weighed them weekly like livestock, the tapeworm pill was not actually that much further than the other things being routinely asked of women's bodies. The patent medicine industry that supported these fantasies of effortless parasitic weight loss was vast and largely unregulated. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 had established some basic standards for labelling, but it was the 1938 Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, passed largely in response to a sulfanilamide disaster that killed over 100 people, that began to meaningfully require that medications be demonstrated safe before marketing. Even then, The boom in amphetamine-based diet products sailed through this regulatory framework with ease, because the drugs were structurally classified as medicine and prescribed by physicians. The patent medicine diet products that fell into greyer legal territory, the ones that claimed to contain parasites, the ones that promised to melt fat through the application of electrical current or vibration, the ones that came in unlabeled vials distributed through beauty salons, operated in a regulatory shadow that persisted well into the post-war period. Among the genuinely dangerous non-pharmaceutical weight loss interventions of the era were products containing dinitrophenol, a compound used in the manufacture of explosives that was, briefly and catastrophically, marketed as a metabolic accelerant in the 1930s. Dinitrophenol works, in a strictly mechanical sense. It disrupts cellular energy metabolism in a way that causes the body to generate enormous amounts of heat, while processing glucose inefficiently, which means the body burns through caloric reserves rapidly. Users reported dramatic weight loss. Users also reported hypothermia, cataracts, peripheral neuropathy, and, in a significant number of documented cases, death. The American Medical Association eventually condemned it. Several American states banned it. It continued to be sold under various trade names for years after the bans. The Hollywood connection to dinitrophenol is difficult to document precisely because the actresses and studios who use such products had every incentive not to put the fact in writing. But the product's primary market was women, and its primary advertising channel was women's magazines and beauty publications, and its primary appeal was to exactly the demographic of women, socially pressured to be thin, willing to accept medical risk as the price of social acceptance, that Hollywood produced in concentrated form. The Starvation Equation, in this period, had many variables. Some of them were pills from a physician, some were pills from a pharmacy without a prescription, some were pills from a beauty salon, some were, very possibly, parasites. All of them were being offered as solutions to a problem that the camera had invented and the studio system had institutionalized, and the women taking them were not, for the most part, irrational. They were operating rationally within a system that had made the irrationality into policy. In 1928, the American Tobacco Company launched an advertising campaign for Lucky Strike cigarettes that changed the history of both the tobacco industry and the dieting industry simultaneously. The campaign's central slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet," was, in the context of what we now know about tobacco marketing and corporate ethics, an act of astonishing, calculated malevolence. It was also one of the most successful advertising campaigns in American history. The campaign was designed by Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and perhaps the most consequential figure in the history of American public relations. Bernays understood that what he was selling was not cigarettes but permission for women to smoke in public, which was still socially transgressive in many contexts, wrapped in the culturally irresistible frame of weight management. A woman who reached for a Lucky Strike instead of a piece of chocolate was not merely satisfying a nicotine craving. She was making an aspirational choice. She was choosing the thin, glamorous modern woman she intended to become. The physiological basis for the claim was not entirely fraudulent. Nicotine is a genuine appetite suppressant. It elevates metabolic rate slightly and reduces the desire to eat, particularly the desire for sweets. The effect is real, though modest. In the context of the 1920s and 1930s, before the carcinogenic and cardiovascular consequences of tobacco use were publicly understood and acknowledged, the trade-off, suppress your appetite, possibly weigh a few pounds less, feel more alert and energized, appeared to many women to be a reasonable one. Bernays' campaign arranged for physicians to publicly endorse the appetite-suppressing properties of cigarettes. He cultivated a network of doctors willing to give newspapers and magazines quotes, supporting the idea that cigarette smoking was an effective and medically reasonable weight management tool. This was not a fringe position in 1928. It was, thanks in significant part to Bernays' orchestration of the medical voice, presented to the public as the considered view of the American medical establishment. Hollywood's relationship with tobacco was already intimate by the time Bernays launched his campaign. Cigarettes were woven into the visual grammar of Hollywood film. The smoke curling from a star's fingertips was a cinematographic tool, creating depth and atmosphere and a certain visual sophistication that the medium had adopted from European art film. Nearly every major studio star smoked on screen. Many smoked off it. The studios, which had financial relationships with tobacco companies, through product placement agreements that predated any formal regulation of such arrangements, had every institutional incentive to ensure that their actresses were seen smoking, and that smoking was visually coded as elegant, modern, and desirable. The overlap between this visual agenda and the appetite suppression agenda was not accidental. It was synergistic. An actress who smoked was photographically appropriate. It created visual interest in ways that sitting emptily at a table did not. An actress who smoked was also, if the Bernays logic held, an actress who ate less. The cigarette was simultaneously a visual prop, a brand endorsement vehicle, and a dietary management tool. The tobacco company endorsements that came directly from Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s are among the most brazen examples of commercial manipulation in American advertising history. Actresses signed contracts with tobacco companies, separate from their studio contracts, adding a layer of income, though the studios took their customary percentage, that required them to appear in print advertisements and radio spots endorsing specific brands. The advertising language frequently and explicitly connected the product to weight maintenance. Chesterfield's 1930s campaign with various film stars was explicit. Smoking was positioned as a sophisticated alternative to eating, and the bodies of the stars endorsing the product were held up as evidence of the product's efficacy. The circular logic, the actress is thin, the actress smokes our cigarettes, therefore smoking our cigarettes will make you thin, was transparent enough that only a culture with no regulatory framework for advertising claims could have allowed it to persist, and mid-century America, in this specific domain, was precisely such a culture. The consequences of this particular starvation mechanism were slower to manifest than the consequences of amphetamine use, but they were catastrophic in their own way. The generation of actresses who began smoking as studio players in the 1930s and 1940s, who smoked because their agents encouraged it, and their studios endorsed it, and their doctors implicitly or explicitly approved it as a weight management tool, suffered the consequences that tobacco consumption produces across a long lifetime. Several died of lung cancer in what should have been their middle years. More developed the cardiovascular diseases that tobacco systematically promotes. The ones who survived to speak about their careers often described smoking as simply part of the diet, part of the whole apparatus of deprivation and pharmaceutical management and caloric restriction that constituted a Hollywood working woman's relationship to her own body across the studio era. Natalie Wood, who smoked throughout her adult life, once told a journalist that she hadn't had a genuinely satisfying meal since she was a child, and that she wasn't sure she'd ever learn to have one. She framed this not as a complaint, but as a simple professional reality. This was what the work cost. The cigarette was just one item on the invoice. The tobacco as diet aid narrative began to fray publicly only in 1964, when the United States Surgeon General's report on smoking and health, the first official American government acknowledgement of the causal link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, landed in American culture with an impact that would take years to fully propagate through behavior and advertising standards. But for the women who had spent the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s reaching for a lucky instead of a sweet, the report came too late to rewrite the equation. The cigarette had already done its work. It had suppressed appetites, maintained weights, been photographed in 1,000 elegant configurations, and quietly, systematically, over many decades and in many lungs, collected its payment. The starvation equation always balanced eventually. The variable that absorbed the cost was always the same. The Hollywood 18-day diet arrived sometime in the late 1920s and spread through the film colony with the speed and inevitability of a rumor that happens to be both true and useful. Its origins are disputed. Various accounts attribute it to various studios, studio physicians, or enterprising individuals who understood that a diet plan associated with Hollywood glamour was a commercially valuable commodity regardless of its actual efficacy. What is not disputed is that it was everywhere, that it was followed, and that it was organized almost entirely around a single citrus fruit. Grapefruit, half a grapefruit before every meal, grapefruit juice in place of other beverages, grapefruit as the spiritual center of a dietary regime that was otherwise a fairly standard, low-calorie starvation protocol dressed up in citrus clothing. The diet's actual caloric prescription ranged in various versions from approximately 800 to 1,000 calories per day, already in the range that modern nutritional science would classify as dangerously low for anyone doing physical work. The addition of grapefruit to every meal was justified through a claim that grapefruit contained a fat-burning enzyme that could not be obtained through other means, a claim that had absolutely no scientific basis and was invented whole cloth by whoever first sat down to write the diet's promotional literature. The fat-burning enzyme myth was so persistent that it survived in various forms for decades, reappearing in 1970s diet books, 1980s health food store pamphlets, and even some 21st century wellness publications before the scientific community finally and definitively put it to rest. There is no fat-burning enzyme in grapefruit. Grapefruit does contain compounds, specifically naringenin and furanocoumarins, that interact with certain medications by inhibiting the enzyme that metabolizes them, which can affect drug levels in the blood. This is a real and clinically significant interaction. It is not weight loss. It is not a mechanism for dissolving fat. The Hollywood diet's central biological claim was fiction. What the Hollywood diet actually accomplished, insofar as it accomplished anything, was a caloric deficit severe enough to produce rapid weight loss through the most basic metabolic mechanism, insufficient caloric intake. The weight lost on such regimes was predominantly water weight and lean muscle mass rather than adipose tissue, which meant it returned quickly when normal eating resumed, which meant the cycle of crash dieting and weight regain that the studio system enforced through its weigh-in protocols became self-perpetuating. The actress would diet severely, lose weight quickly, regain it when her body rebelled, diet severely again. The chronic, repeated cycling of dramatic weight restriction, followed by compensatory eating patterns, is now understood to produce metabolic damage that makes long-term weight management progressively more difficult, a fact the studio physicians of the era either did not know or chose not to prioritize. The 1930s and 1940s produced crash diets in extraordinary variety. Some were organized around single foods: the grapefruit, the hard-boiled egg, the cottage cheese, the raw vegetable, that possessed some real or imagined special property that justified the severe restriction of everything else. Some were organized around the elimination of entire food categories: no carbohydrates, no fats, no solids at all. Some were presented as medical protocols backed by physician endorsement. Some were simply commercial products packaged in ways that implied medical endorsement without actually having it. The cabbage soup diet, the master cleanse in its early forms, the protein-only protocols that anticipated later high-protein diet movements, all of these had predecessors and partial versions circulating through Hollywood in the mid-century period. What they shared was a combination of dramatic short-term results and an almost complete absence of long-term efficacy, and what they shared further was a market of women who were structurally motivated to try the next thing when the last thing had, as it inevitably did, stopped working. Into this market in the 1950s arrived the liquid diet. The metrical phenomenon of the late 1950s and early 1960s is a fascinating document in the history of the American diet industry. Metrical was a commercially produced liquid diet formula, a predecessor to the later Slim Fast and similar products, that promised complete nutrition at approximately 900 calories per day, consumed entirely in liquid form. It was marketed initially to physicians and hospitals for use with medically obese patients. Within 2 years of its commercial release, it was a national phenomenon, advertised in mainstream media, endorsed by celebrities, and consumed by millions of American women who were not by any medical standard obese but who had absorbed enough of the culture's thinness imperative to want to eat nothing but a milky liquid for weeks at a time. Hollywood responded to Metricol and its competitors with the particular enthusiasm of a community that had been looking for exactly this product, something that could be clinically framed as nutritionally adequate while making normal eating completely unnecessary. An actress on a liquid diet was an actress whose caloric intake was precisely known and controlled, who could not be tempted by a commissary meal, and whose body could be predicted to reduce at a calculable rate. It was, from a studio management perspective, a satisfying technological solution to the persistent problem of the actress's appetite. The grapefruit, the hard-boiled egg, the Metricol can, these were not merely dietary choices. They were enrollment documents in a system that had decided what women's bodies were for and would accept any amount of nutritional absurdity in service of that decision. The crash diet culture of mid-century Hollywood was simultaneously a product of the studio system's coercive body management and a product of a broader consumer culture that had identified thinness as the paramount female virtue and was willing to sell any product that promised to deliver it. The crash diet worked, briefly, then it didn't. Then there was another crash diet, and another physician, and another pill, and always, always the grapefruit. Half a grapefruit before everything, as though the bitterness of it was itself the point. In 1960, a clinic in Zurich was reportedly placing clients under sedation for extended periods, days, sometimes more than a week, during which they would lose weight simply by not eating. The sleeping beauty treatment, as it was sometimes called in the medical press and the popular press that followed medical trends with one eye on scandal, was not a Hollywood invention. But Hollywood, which had a long relationship with European weight loss clinics and spas and the fashionable medicine that circulated through them, found it immediately and enthusiastically interesting. The logic was, in the most stripped-down sense, coherent. If you are asleep, you cannot eat. You cannot be hungry. You cannot call room service. You cannot be seduced by the smell of bread from a studio commissary or the sight of a craft services table laden with lunch. You simply sleep, burning your body's reserves at a resting metabolic rate, emerging thinner. The problems with this logic were numerous and range from the moderately concerning to the genuinely dangerous. Extended sedation is not a trivial medical intervention. The barbiturates and other sedative compounds used in these protocols were not surgically precise in their effects. They suppressed not just consciousness, but respiration, cardiovascular function, and the body's regulatory mechanisms in ways that required careful monitoring to avoid the kind of outcomes that killed patients. The careful monitoring available at any given establishment offering the sleeping cure varied considerably, from genuinely medically supervised facilities to what were essentially expensive hotels with a willingness to administer sedatives and no particular infrastructure for managing the consequences if something went wrong. What qualified as going wrong in such settings ranged from the deeply uncomfortable. The patient woke disoriented, malnourished and dehydrated, having lost the weight as advertised but at some cost to her basic physiological functioning, to the permanently catastrophic, in cases where respiratory depression went undetected and patients did not wake at all. The historical record on outcomes for these extended sedation weight loss regimes is necessarily incomplete, because the establishments offering them were not primarily documentation facilities, and because their clients had strong incentives not to publicize their participation. Hollywood's relationship with European weight loss clinics was, by the mid-1950s, well established. Several major studios had informal arrangements with clinics in Switzerland, Germany and France, places where actresses could be sent discreetly between productions for what the studio press releases described as rest and recuperation, and what was often a more intensive program of dietary restriction and pharmaceutical management. The European clinic was a solution to a particular studio problem: how to rapidly transform a body without subjecting the actress to scrutiny in Los Angeles, where her weight loss or gain would be immediately noted and reported by the gossip press. At these clinics, the menu of available interventions was considerably more eclectic than what American physicians could prescribe under American medical regulation. European pharmaceutical markets were differently regulated, and the ethos of European spa medicine, which had roots in 19th century water cure traditions and had evolved into a sophisticated industry catering to wealthy patients who wanted results, was considerably more permissive about experimental approaches than its American counterpart. Among the interventions available at the more adventurous European clinics were thyroid extract injections, administering bovine or porcine thyroid hormone to patients whose thyroid function was entirely normal, with the goal of artificially accelerating their metabolic rate. This was effective, in the same sense that applying a blowtorch to a fuse is effective at making the fuse burn faster. It achieved the desired result through a mechanism that was also systematically damaging to the systems it was applied to. Hyperthyroid symptoms, elevated heart rate, anxiety, insomnia, muscle weakness, bone loss, were the price of the metabolic acceleration, and they were paid quietly, folded into the general condition of being a working actress, in a system that demanded too much and questioned nothing. Human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, a hormone produced during pregnancy, was another European clinic specialty that found its way into Hollywood weight loss culture. The HCG diet protocol, which combined injections of the hormone with an extraordinarily low-calorie diet of approximately 500 calories per day, was developed by a British physician named A.T.W. Simeons and published in The Lancet in 1954. Simeons claimed that HCG redistributed fat storage patterns in the body in a way that made the 500-calorie diet uniquely sustainable and effective. Clinical trials did not support this claim, and the consensus of endocrinology is that the HCG in Simeon's protocol was doing nothing. The weight loss was attributable entirely to the 500-calorie diet, which would produce rapid weight loss in virtually anyone, regardless of what they were injecting. Nevertheless, HCG diet clinics proliferated in Europe and then in America throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and Hollywood was among the most enthusiastic adopters. The protocol had several features that made it particularly appealing in the studio context. It was medically supervised, it produced rapid weight loss, it involved regular physician contact that could be described to studios and press agents as medical care, and it required the actress to maintain a caloric intake so low that rapid weight reduction was essentially guaranteed. That the HCG component was doing nothing was, in the operational context, irrelevant. The 500-calorie diet was doing everything. The hormone was the justification. The sleeping cure, the HCG injections, the thyroid extracts, these were the medical sounding instruments of a system that had decided the desired result, a body of particular dimensions, justified whatever mechanism could be devised to produce it. The medical framing was not incidental, it was essential. It transformed systematic starvation into professional management. It made the women complicit in their own depletion by placing a physician's authority between them and the recognition that what was being done to their bodies was harmful. The white coat was not protection. It was a costume. Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper were, between them, read by an estimated 75 million Americans every week during the height of their influence in the 1940s. They were not merely gossip columnists in the way that term is now used, chroniclers of celebrity behavior, marginally relevant to the culture at large. They were power brokers. They had access to studios and studio heads that most journalists could not imagine. They had the capacity to make or destroy careers through what they published, and, more importantly, through what they chose not to publish. They were both, in their ways, extensions of the studio system's publicity apparatus, simultaneously dependent on the studios for access and possessed of enough independent cultural authority to be genuinely feared by the studios they depended on. And both of them policed the bodies of female stars with a thoroughness and a cruelty that has been somewhat laundered out of their popular legacy. Weight was a primary subject of both columnists' coverage of female stars. A star who appeared to have gained weight between productions was fair game for commentary that could range from the arch-encoded, references to an actress having filled out or enjoyed her holiday, to the explicitly cruel describing physical changes in language that would today be recognized as body-shaming in its most direct form. The Parsons and Hopper columns were read by studio executives who acted on what they read. An actress who appeared in Hedda Hopper's column as having let herself go could expect a call from her studio within days. This created a feedback loop of surveillance and self-regulation that was arguably more effective than any institutional weigh-in program. The gossip column was read by everyone: the actress, her agent, her studio, and 75 million American readers who formed the audience the actress depended on. The threat of appearing in print as an actress who had grown heavy was a constant invisible pressure that operated at all times, in all contexts, whether or not a columnist was actually present. The role of the male gaze in Hollywood's weight culture has been extensively analysed, but the role of the female gaze, the particular surveillance that women exercised on other women within the Hollywood power structure, is perhaps equally important and less well examined. Parsons and Hopper were not the only powerful women enforcing body standards. Fashion editors, studio wardrobe supervisors, female agents, and the informal social hierarchies of studio society all contributed to a surveillance apparatus in which every woman in the film community was potentially the observer and potentially the observed. A particularly brutal aspect of this surveillance was its public-private hybridity. The gossip column published what had previously been observed in private, at a studio commissary, at a party, on a film set. The observation itself was normalized as part of the professional landscape. Of course, people were looking. Everyone was always looking. An actress who forgot she was being looked at was an actress who might relax her vigilance for a moment, eat something she shouldn't, and find the evidence of her lapse in 75 million morning newspapers. The specific mechanisms by which gossip column body surveillance translated into dietary behavior are difficult to document precisely, because the actresses subjected to it were rarely candid about the full extent to which they managed their bodies in response to media pressure. What survives is mostly inference. The pattern of diet-related stories in studio press releases following periods of columnist attention, the accounts of studio staff who remembered the ripple effect of a Parsons or Hopper mention, the memoirs of actresses who wrote, often decades later and with varying degrees of candour, about the relationship between the column and the pill bottle. What is clear is that the gossip industry was not simply reporting on Hollywood's body culture, it was producing it. By establishing and continuously reinforcing the norm of extreme thinness as the appropriate female Hollywood body, by treating any deviation from that norm as legitimate public news, and by wielding the threat of that coverage as a social control mechanism, the gossip columnists of the mid-century era were as responsible for the Starvation Equation as any studio doctor or studio head. The audience's role in this system is uncomfortable to contemplate. 75 million readers read Parsons and Hopper. Millions more read the secondary and tertiary gossip publications that took their cues from the major columns. The appetite for this material, including the body commentary, was real, and it was consumer-driven. The readership wanted to know whether an actress was getting heavy. They wanted the columnist to tell them. The columnists were, in this sense, responding to a market demand. That market demand was itself the product of a culture that had been taught, by the very industry being reported on, that a woman's value was substantially expressed by the dimensions of her body. The circular logic is dizzying. Hollywood made women with particular bodies into objects of desire. The gossip industry reported on those bodies as public property. The public consumed both the films and the coverage. The studio system used the coverage as leverage to enforce the bodies, and the actresses whose bodies were at issue absorbed the cost of the whole system and received in return a kind of fame that felt, from the outside, like privilege. From the inside, it felt like something else, something that had a great deal in common with a 500-calorie day, a bottle of pills, and a mirror that told you the truth about what all of it was costing. The fan magazine ecosystem that Parsons and Hopper anchored was considerably larger than the two flagship columns. Publications like Photoplay, Modern Screen, and Motion Picture reached millions of American readers every month, and a significant portion of their content was organized around the management of female celebrity bodies. Diet articles, weight loss revelations, body transformation stories, and thinly veiled body criticism constituted a reliable editorial staple across the entire fan magazine category for the full span of the mid-century period. These publications were read primarily by women and girls, the audience that was also the studio system's primary target demographic for body norm enforcement. A teenage girl in Akron or Phoenix or rural Mississippi who had no other access to Hollywood life could read, every month, detailed instructions for how Hollywood stars maintain their figures, with the implied and sometimes explicit suggestion that the reader should apply the same methods to her own body. The democratization of the Starvation Equation was accomplished not through the studio system's direct institutional reach, but through the mass media apparatus of fan publications that translated the studio system's body management logic into aspirational consumer content. The body surveillance of the gossip column and the fan magazine was thus not merely a Hollywood internal phenomenon, it was a teaching mechanism, a system by which the body norms the studio system enforced on its female talent were transmitted to the general population as the appropriate standards for all female bodies. The actress, who was punished for gaining weight by the studio weigh-in and the gossip column, was simultaneously modelling, for millions of readers, the principle that weight gain in women was a public failure deserving public commentary. The reader who internalised that model was a reader who would apply it, first to her evaluation of actresses, and then, with the efficiency of a culture that moves its standards from screen to mirror, to herself. This is how the Starvation Equation escaped the studio lot, not through any deliberate export strategy, but through the ordinary workings of a media culture that was already the most powerful body-norming mechanism in human history. And that was, in the mid-century period, only just beginning to understand what it was doing. The thyroid gland is a small, butterfly-shaped structure at the base of the throat that regulates metabolic rate, in a way so fundamental to the body's functioning that medicine now devotes an entire specialty to its disorders. When the thyroid produces insufficient hormone, hyperthyroidism, the metabolic rate slows, body temperature drops, weight accumulates, energy drops, and the mind fogs. When it produces too much, hyperthyroidism, the metabolic rate accelerates, The heart races, the body runs hot and fast, weight drops, and the mind becomes irritable, anxious, and unstable. These are not minor variations in bodily experience, they are systemic states that affect every cell and organ. In the mid-century Hollywood context, the thyroid was a target. The logic was the same logic that drove every other pharmaceutical intervention in the Starvation Equation. If the body's metabolic rate could be artificially elevated, more calories would be burned, less weight would accumulate, and the actress's body would more closely approximate the camera's requirements. The thyroid was the body's own metabolic control system. Manipulating it was, in theory, manipulating the metabolic rate itself. The practice of administering thyroid hormone to patients with normal thyroid function for the purpose of weight loss was not fringe medicine in the 1940s and 1950s. It was practiced by mainstream physicians, prescribed at mainstream pharmacies, and accepted as a reasonable medical intervention within the relatively permissive pharmaceutical culture of the era. The drug used was desiccated thyroid, ground, dried animal thyroid tissue, which contains a mixture of T3 and T4 thyroid hormones, or, increasingly as the century progressed, synthetic thyroid hormone preparations. At therapeutic doses appropriate for patients with genuine hypothyroidism, these medications restore normal metabolic function. At supraphysiologic doses, the doses required to actually elevate the metabolic rate of a person whose thyroid is already functioning normally, they produce symptoms consistent with clinical hypothyroidism: tachycardia, palpitations, elevated blood pressure, anxiety, insomnia, fine tremor, excessive sweating, heat intolerance, and over time, cardiac arrhythmias, heart failure, and bone loss. Taken for long enough and at high enough doses, thyroid hormone administration to a person with a healthy thyroid also suppresses the body's own thyroid production. When the medication is discontinued, the body's natural thyroid function takes time to recover, weeks to months, during which the patient experiences the full misery of induced hypothyroidism and the metabolic rebound weight gain that follows. In Hollywood, thyroid hormone administration for weight loss became common enough through the 1940s and 1950s that studio physicians prescribed it with the same casualness they brought to amphetamines. The combination of thyroid hormone with amphetamines, a pharmacological double whammy that elevated metabolic rate through two separate mechanisms simultaneously, was not unusual in studio medicine. Neither was the combination of all three major diet interventions: amphetamines, thyroid hormone, and severe caloric restriction, each reinforcing the other's effects while compounding the physiological damage each one produced in isolation. An actress on this combination protocol was an actress running at an artificially elevated metabolic rate on inadequate fuel. Her body was consuming itself at an accelerated pace. Her heart was working harder than it was designed to work. Her adrenal system was in a state of chronic stimulation. Her bones were quietly losing density. Her muscle mass was depleting. Her hormonal systems were disordered in ways that would take years, sometimes decades, to manifest as recognizable clinical conditions. The studio system's management of these medical crises was notably effective at preventing them from becoming public knowledge. When an actress collapsed from a combination of malnutrition, amphetamine exhaustion, and thyroid toxicity, which happened and more than occasionally, the studio's publicity apparatus described it as exhaustion, as nervous collapse, as a viral illness. The actress was installed in a private clinic or an expensive hospital room with a private nurse and kept out of public circulation until she had recovered sufficiently to resume work. The studio doctor adjusted the medications. The studio resumed paying the actress's salary, or didn't, depending on their contractual relationship during illness periods, and eventually the actress went back to work, back to the diet, back to the pills. Because the alternative, ending the diet, stopping the pills, eating normally, was not an option the system made available. The thyroid manipulation of mid-century Hollywood produced consequences that are difficult to fully trace because the records were kept inside a closed system, studio medical files that were eventually destroyed, private physicians who owed their livelihood to the system they served, and women who had learned, over years and decades, not to speak publicly about the machinery that was managing their bodies. What survives in the record are the careers interrupted by what were described as health problems, the early deaths attributed to heart disease and liver disease, and the general systemic failures of bodies that had been run too hard on too little, and the memoirs of the women who lived long enough to understand and articulate what had been done to them. Not all of them understood it clearly. Some went to their deaths believing that the medical care they had received was the best available, and that the health problems they had experienced were simply their fate, their constitution, the particular fragility of a body that happened also to be beautiful. Some of them had internalized the studio system's logic so thoroughly that they accepted the damage as the reasonable price of the work. The ones who saw it clearly and said so usually said so late, when the career was over, when the studios no longer controlled the narrative, when the gossip columnists had moved on to younger faces and the weigh-in appointments had ended. By then, the thyroid had already paid what was owed. Hollywood in the mid-century period was the dominant global entertainment industry in a way that has no precise contemporary equivalent. American films were not merely popular internationally, they were, in many markets, the cinema. European film industries had been devastated or reoriented by the Second World War. Asian film industries were in varying states of recovery or development. Latin American audiences consumed American product with an intensity that Hollywood studio heads tracked, with the same attention they gave their domestic numbers. This dominance had consequences that extended well beyond the commercial. Hollywood was exporting a visual vocabulary, a set of images, narratives, and bodies that became, for hundreds of millions of people around the world, the reference point for what Western glamour, Western beauty, and Western femininity looked like, and what Western femininity looked like as projected through the studio system's body management apparatus was thin. The fashion industry, which had its own complex relationship with Hollywood and with the bodies of Hollywood stars, amplified and extended the reach of Hollywood's body norm in ways the studios themselves could not have achieved alone. The magazines, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and their international editions, used Hollywood actresses as style reference points while simultaneously pushing the fashion industry's own thinness imperative, which was, if anything, more extreme than Hollywood's. The Paris couturiers of the post-war period designed clothes for bodies that were already thin by any reasonable standard, and the magazines that displayed those clothes and those bodies created an aspirational image that was available globally even to women who would never see a Hollywood film. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing. Hollywood stars appeared in fashion magazines wearing couture. The couture assumed and enforced a thin body. The Hollywood body management system was calibrated partly by the couture assumption. The fashion magazines covered the Hollywood stars and the couture simultaneously, welding the two body norms into a single, global image of appropriate female beauty. The diet industry that grew up in the shadow of this global body norm was not a Hollywood creation, but it was a Hollywood-inflected one. The weight loss products, programs, and surgical interventions that proliferated through the 1950s and into the 1960s in American and European consumer markets were selling the Hollywood body, or rather they were selling access to the Hollywood body. The implied promise that the purchaser could, through sufficient application of the right product or program, achieve the same visual result as the women on the screen. This promise was structurally dishonest. The bodies on screen were not the product of a single diet or a single pill or a single program. They were the product of comprehensive systems of caloric deprivation, pharmaceutical intervention, professional makeup and hair and costume, cinematographic technique, and, crucially, the complete unavailability of a normal relationship to food. The Hollywood actress who appeared on screen looking effortlessly slender had achieved that appearance through a system that no consumer product could replicate, and the weight loss industry selling that appearance knew it. The international dimensions of Hollywood's body export became particularly visible in the phenomenon of European actresses brought to Hollywood specifically because of their body types, and then subjected, upon arrival, to the full weight of the studio body management system. The Italian neo-realist film movement and the French New Wave had produced actresses whose beauty was understood, in the European critical tradition, in terms that included curves, softness, and a physical presence that was explicitly not the Hollywood thin. These actresses, whose names were internationally famous, whose films had won festivals, whose figures were celebrated in their home countries, arrived in Hollywood to find the studio system appraising their bodies with the same industrial calculation it applied to every contract player. Several of them were told immediately that they were too heavy. Several were put on studio diets. Several quietly left and returned to Europe where their bodies were valued rather than managed. The post-war period also saw the beginning of American television, which created a new and even more invasive body surveillance medium than cinema. The television set brought moving images of female bodies into the domestic interior, into living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, at a frequency and intimacy that cinema, however globally dominant, could not match. Television actresses were subject to the same body management pressures as film actresses, but with the added demand of weekly production schedules that left no time for the recovery periods that film production's longer rhythms allowed. The television camera, shot on early black and white video, was in some respects even less forgiving than the film camera. Its lower resolution and flatter lighting emphasized mass and softness in ways that the carefully controlled cinematography of studio film could mitigate. Actresses moving from film to television often found themselves advised to lose weight specifically for the television medium, and the television audience, in their living rooms, watching the tiny screen, was absorbing episode by episode, week by week, year by year, a body norm that the studios had manufactured and the global media apparatus was distributing to every country with the television market. The export of Hollywood's body image was not a conspiracy. It was the ordinary operation of a cultural industry whose reach exceeded the capacity of any single studio's intention or any single era's awareness. But its consequences were profound and lasted long after the specific mechanisms of the studio body management system had faded. The body norm that the Hollywood system enforced on its female talent in the 1930s, 1940s and 1950s became, through the medium of global cinema and then television, the aspirational standard for female beauty in markets that had no other reference point for the Western ideal. The girls who grew up watching American films in Mexico City and Paris and Tokyo were not watching studio contract negotiations or physician prescription pads. They were watching Grace Kelly, Audrey Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor at her thinnest, Doris Day, Janet Leigh. They were watching the product, the perfected, camera-ready, pharmacologically maintained product, and receiving it as the natural expression of desirable womanhood. The Starvation Equation had found its most efficient distribution channel, and it would spend the rest of the century running. By the mid-1950s, a new variable had been introduced to the Starvation Equation, one that promised, for the first time, to circumvent the metabolic resistance of the human body entirely. Where diet and pills failed, where the body stubbornly refused to conform to the camera's requirements, through chemical or caloric manipulation, surgery could potentially intervene directly in the tissue itself. The history of cosmetic surgery in America predates Hollywood by decades. Rhinoplasty, surgical modification of the nose, was being performed in American cities by the turn of the 20th century, borrowed from European surgical traditions that had developed reconstructive techniques during the First World War. Ear correction, eyelid surgery, and various procedures to repair or disguise the effects of aging were available in major American cities by the 1920s. Hollywood adopted cosmetic surgery early and discreetly, in the same spirit it adopted everything else that could maintain the appearance standard the camera required. Weight-related cosmetic procedures in this period were limited by the surgical technology available. Liposuction would not be developed until the 1970s. Its precursor, a crude and dangerous technique that removed fat tissue through blunt instrumentation, was occasionally practiced in Europe but had not achieved mainstream clinical adoption. What was available to the Hollywood actress seeking surgical assistance with weight management in the 1950s was primarily abdominoplasty, what would later be called a tummy tuck, and various procedures to remove or reposition fat deposits in specific locations. These procedures were performed in the Hollywood context in the same atmosphere of medical normalization and institutional discretion that characterized the pharmaceutical management of actresses' bodies. The studio physician who prescribed the amphetamines might make the referral to the surgeon. The surgeon operated in a private facility. The studio press apparatus described the actress's absence from production as a rest cure or minor illness. The actress returned to the set with a new body that the camera greeted with the indifference of professional satisfaction. But the surgical interventions of the 1950s Hollywood aesthetic period were about more than weight management in the strict sense. They were about total body engineering, the systematic modification of the face and body to achieve the visual specifications that the studio's particular aesthetics required. Rhinoplasties were performed on actresses whose noses were deemed insufficiently classical. Jaw surgeries altered the proportions of faces that didn't photograph correctly. Brow lifts and eye lifts maintained the appearance of youth in actresses whose careers depended on that appearance. The cosmetic surgery industry's relationship with Hollywood was, in this period, symbiotic and mutually promotional. The surgeon who operated on major stars had access to the most famous bodies in the world as his portfolio, a portfolio he could not advertise in any conventional sense, given the intense secrecy surrounding his work, but whose existence was known to every wealthy woman in Los Angeles who wanted the best. The reputation circulated through the same informal network that carried every other piece of Hollywood insider knowledge, through agents and publicists and studio executives' wives and the social infrastructure of Beverly Hills and Bel Air. The relationship between cosmetic surgery and the diet and pharmaceutical complex of mid-century Hollywood was not one of competition, but of complementarity. Surgery could remove or reposition specific deposits of tissue, but it could not replace the metabolic management that kept an actress thin across her whole body, rather than merely in one location. The two systems operated in parallel. Pills and starvation managed the overall body weight. Surgery addressed the specific architectural features that the overall body weight management couldn't reach. What neither system addressed was the psychological dimension of living inside a body that was continuously managed, modified, and evaluated by institutional forces external to the self. The actresses who navigated the full spectrum of mid-century Hollywood body management, the diet, the pills, the surgery, the weekly weigh-in, the gossip column surveillance, were doing so in a cultural context that gave them essentially no framework for understanding what was being done to them as harmful. The medical framing insisted it was care. The studio framing insisted it was professionalism. The social framing insisted it was beauty. The dawn of cosmetic intervention in Hollywood was also the dawn of a new cultural norm about the modifiability of the body. The idea that the body was not a given but a project, subject to continuous improvement through available technical means. This norm, which the cosmetic surgery industry would spend the next half-century amplifying and commercializing, had its clearest early expression in Hollywood, where the modifiability of the body was simply one extension of the more general principle that everything about an actress's public presentation was subject to the studio's engineering. The body as project, the body as production, the body as the raw material from which the camera's required image would be manufactured by whatever means were technically available. This was the logic that the Starvation Equation had always operated on. Surgery simply extended the technical vocabulary by which that logic expressed itself. The surgical threshold, once crossed, also opened the door to a broader medical permissiveness that saw some Hollywood physicians prescribing what the diet industry press of the era cheerfully called rainbow pills, multi-drug cocktail regimens in which different coloured tablets and capsules were combined into a single daily protocol. A typical rainbow pill regimen of the late 1950s might include a diuretic to shed water weight, an amphetamine for appetite suppression and energy, a thyroid hormone to boost metabolic rate, a laxative to accelerate elimination, a barbiturate to manage the insomnia the other drugs created, and a B vitamin injection to address the nutritional deficiencies the entire stack was producing. The effect was total pharmacological management of the body's metabolic and regulatory systems simultaneously, a kind of pharmaceutical override in which the physician's prescriptions replaced the body's own internal regulatory signals. The physician decided how fast the metabolism ran. The physician decided how much fluid the body retained. The physician decided whether the client was hungry or not. The body, under sufficient pharmaceutical pressure, complied. The rainbow pill practitioners were not all frauds in the criminal sense. Some were genuinely convinced that they were providing effective, medically appropriate care. The pharmaceutical industry's marketing had been sufficiently persuasive that some physicians believed, without much critical examination, that the combination protocols they were prescribing were both safe and efficacious. The regulatory framework had not yet caught up to the pharmacological reality, and the patients, the actresses and socialites and wealthy housewives who drove to Beverly Hills and paid handsomely for these protocols, were not in most cases complaining about the results. The results in the short term were exactly what had been promised. You lost weight rapidly, you had energy, you felt or you performed feeling better than you had felt before. The long-term results were quieter and took longer to arrive, but they arrived with the same certainty that all delayed debts eventually produced their accounting. The rainbow pills, the surgery, the sleeping cures, the tapeworm mythology, the grapefruit gospel. All of them were, in the end, different expressions of the same cultural imperative, translated into different technical vocabularies by successive generations of practitioners who understood the market they were serving even when they did not fully understand, or chose not to understand, the cost they were extracting from it. The studio system's control over the narratives of its female talent did not end when the studio system itself began to collapse in the 1950s, under the pressure of the Paramount decrees, the rise of television, and the gradual dissolution of the ironclad contract. The system had created, in the women who passed through it, a particular disposition towards silence, a learned understanding that certain truths about the working conditions of female Hollywood were not to be shared in public, for reasons that range from contractual obligation to simple shame to the genuine belief that what had been done to them was normal and therefore not worth describing. The breaking of that silence happened in waves. It happened when actresses who had survived the system and remained working could speak from positions of relative security. It happened when actresses who were no longer working had nothing further to protect. It happened, sometimes, when illness made the costs visible and concrete in a way that demanded acknowledgement. Judy Garland, who had more reason to speak and was more willing to do so than almost any of her contemporaries, began giving interviews in the 1960s and later that described, with remarkable and sometimes almost clinical precision, the pharmacological management of her body from childhood onward. She described the pills the studio physician had given her. She described the diets. She described the way the pills had affected her sleep, her appetite, her nerves, her ability to function in the world. She described the way the system had worked, because she was inside it as a child before she had the cognitive or social resources to resist or even fully understand it. The public reception of these accounts was complicated. Garland was beloved, but she was also by the 1960s understood through the frame of tragedy. The gifted star whose personal difficulties had complicated her career and diminished her later years. This frame both amplified and discounted her testimony. Amplified because the tragedy narrative made her account newsworthy and emotionally compelling. Discounted because the tragedy frame allowed her specific indictments of the studio system to be absorbed into a more general narrative about her particular susceptibility to difficulty, rather than heard as structural critique. Shirley Temple Black's 1988 autobiography described the sexual coercion she had experienced during her studio years with a candour that was, at the time of publication, somewhat remarkable. And her account of the general working conditions of child actors in the studio system, including the management of young performers' bodies and diets, contributed to a growing literature of studio-era testimony that began to establish, through accumulation, what individual accounts could not establish in isolation, that the conditions were systemic, not exceptional. Carrie Fisher was among the most articulately candid of the post-studio era testimony, and she had the particular advantage of having grown up inside Hollywood as the child of a studio-era actress, which gave her access to the system's logic at a generational remove that sharpened rather than softened her understanding of it. Her accounts of the pharmaceutical management of her own weight and psychiatric condition in her adult film career were delivered with a wit that could make you laugh before you registered what she was actually describing. The testimonial literature of Hollywood's body management system has a particular character. It accumulates detail. Individual accounts describe specific pills, specific diets, specific interactions with studio physicians and studio executives. But across the accounts, the same patterns repeat. The same mechanisms appear in different studios, different decades, different individual lives. The studio physician who prescribes amphetamines appears in accounts separated by 20 years of production history. The weekly weigh-in appears in accounts from MGM, from Paramount, from the smaller studios. The gossip column pressure appears in accounts from the 1930s and from the 1960s. The repetition is itself the testimony. It is the evidence that these were not individual incidents of unfortunate medical management or individual experiences of unusual professional pressure. They were policy. They were system. They were the operating logic of an industrial complex that had decided the body of the working actress was its property to manage and was willing to deploy whatever technical means were available to manage it. The studio system's own records are of limited use in reconstructing the full picture, because the most sensitive elements of body management, the pharmaceutical prescriptions, the surgical referrals, the conversations between studio physicians and studio management about an actress's weight, were either never committed to paper in the form that would survive as historical record, or were committed to medical files that were subsequently destroyed, or that remain subject to privacy protections that prevent their examination. What survives is circumstantial in the strict evidential sense, but overwhelming in its consistency. The patterns in the testimonial record, in the studio publicity records, in the medical and pharmaceutical histories of the era, in the careers interrupted by health problems that dot the industry's timeline, in the early deaths, in the chronic illnesses, all of it points to the same systemic reality. And the women who talked, the ones who wrote the memoirs, gave the interviews, described in public what had been done to their bodies in private, are, in the end, the archive that matters most. Not because they were objective, because they were there. They were inside the starvation equation when it was running, and what they remembered and chose to say is the closest thing we have to the truth of what it cost. Among the most instructive figures in the testimonial record are the women who resisted the system, not always successfully and not always consistently, but in ways that are documented enough to understand. Their resistance takes several forms. Some refused specific medical interventions, a studio physician's amphetamine prescription declined, a dietary protocol quietly ignored, a weigh-in appointment perpetually rescheduled. Some negotiated contractual protections that limited the studio's ability to mandate weight management. Some simply ate. Not in defiance exactly, but with a directness that the system read as defiance. Kate Smith, whose robust figure was as famous as her voice, navigated a career that was explicitly publicly organised around the acceptance of a body that no mid-century studio would have considered camera-ready. She was a radio phenomenon before she was a film phenomenon, and the radio career created a base of public affection large enough that no studio could simply reduce her to her measurements. Her body was part of her brand in a way that inverted the standard Hollywood logic, not despite its departure from the studio norm, but in a curious way because of it. The contractual strategies of resistance were less dramatic, but perhaps more systematically significant. Some agents, a minority but a documented minority, negotiated contracts with studio body management provisions that were less comprehensive than the standard. Some actresses found studios whose aesthetic preferences happened to align with their natural body type and spent their careers in the relative safety of that alignment. Some moved between studios in ways that disrupted the weigh-in continuity and avoided the full weight of long-term institutional monitoring. None of these were clean escapes. The gossip column surveillance was industry-wide. The camera's technical requirements did not vary by studio. The culture that created the demand for thin actresses was not a studio artifact, but a cultural condition that pervaded the entire commercial and social environment in which any actress worked. But the women who resisted, even partially, even inconsistently, leave something in the record that the women who are fully consumed by the system do not. They leave the evidence that the system was not natural, that its demands were not inevitable, that the starvation equation, for all its industrial efficiency, was not the only possible way to make a movie or tell a story, or put a woman on a screen and ask an audience to care about her. This is the piece of testimony that the survivors who talked were ultimately delivering, whether they named it that way or not. The system was not natural. What was done to us was not necessary. Something else was possible. We did not get the something else. But knowing it was possible, knowing the equation was a choice, not a law, is where any meaningful reckoning has to begin. The studio system that produced the starvation equation in its most concentrated and industrialized form was substantially dismantled by the end of the 1960s, the Paramount Decrees of 1948, which required the studios to divest their theatre chains and ended the vertical integration model that had given the studios total control of production, distribution, and exhibition, began a slow, structural dissolution that took 2 decades to fully complete. The long-term contract system that had bound actresses to studios in relationships of comprehensive dependency ended as the independent production model increasingly replaced the studio factory model. The studio physician, whose primary loyalty was to the studio rather than the patient, became less central as the industry's structure became less totalizing. But the cultural logic that the studio system had installed, the specific body norm it had broadcast globally for 4 decades, and the institutional mechanisms it had developed for enforcing that norm, did not dissolve with the studio structure that had produced them. The diet industry that had grown up supplying Hollywood's body management needs was, by the 1970s, a mainstream consumer industry serving a mass market that Hollywood's body norm had created and continued to supply. Weight Watchers, founded in 1963, went public in the 1970s and became a global corporation. The Atkins Diet, published in 1972, reproduced in paperback form the same low-carbohydrate logic that studio physicians had been deploying since the 1940s. The Slim Fast Company, launched in 1977, was the commercial successor to the Metrical phenomenon of the 1950s. Each of these products was selling the same promise that the studio system's body management apparatus had been organized around: the possibility of achieving, through sufficient disciplinary application of the right method, the body that the culture held up as desirable, the body on the billboard, the body on the screen, the body that belonged, as far as the cultural logic was concerned, to women, and specifically to women who understood that the management of their physical form was a continuous professional and social obligation. The eating disorder recognition movement of the 1970s and 1980s, the clinical identification and naming of anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa as psychiatric conditions requiring treatment, represented the first systematic attempt to understand, in clinical terms, what the studio system had been producing as a standard operating condition for 4 decades. The patterns that clinicians were identifying and naming in the 1970s, the severe caloric restriction, the distorted body image, the use of compensatory behaviors, the relationship between external pressure and disordered eating, were patterns that had been running in Hollywood's body management system since the 1930s. The clinical literature did not typically connect these conditions to their Hollywood antecedents. It was not part of the medical framing to ask, how did the culture create the conditions in which this disorder could flourish? The medical framing asked, how do we treat the disorder in the individual patient? Both questions are valid, but the second, in the absence of the first, produces a system in which individual patients are treated, while the cultural mechanisms that produce the disorder in the first place continue to operate. The celebrity eating disorder disclosure that became a feature of the 1980s and 1990s cultural landscape, the actress or singer who revealed, in a profile or a memoir, that she had struggled with anorexia or bulimia, represents a complicated cultural development. On one hand, these disclosures were genuine acts of courage that helped destigmatize the disorders and provided identification for women suffering in private. On the other hand, many of the celebrities making these disclosures were doing so in media contexts that simultaneously celebrated the thin bodies the disorders had produced. The magazine profile that described an actress's eating disorder appeared alongside photographs of that actress looking glamorously thin, which created a communication that was, to say the least, mixed. The diet industry that received its raw material from Hollywood's body norm was worth, by the 1990s, approximately $30 billion annually in the United States alone. Global numbers were larger. The industry had developed into a complex ecosystem of programs, publications, products, pharmaceutical aids, and eventually surgical interventions. The liposuction that Hollywood had been seeking surgically in the 1950s was now a consumer product available to anyone with the insurance coverage or the out-of-pocket funds to pay for it. The specific pharmaceutical mechanisms have evolved. The benzodrine and dexedrine of the studio era have been replaced by a pharmacopoeia of weight loss drugs that have progressed through several generations, from the fenfluramine-phentermine combination that was withdrawn in the 1990s after being linked to cardiac valve damage, to the more recent GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs that achieve weight loss through mechanisms that the studio physicians of the mid-century would have found indistinguishable from the amphetamine mechanism they were prescribing, reducing appetite, making food less compelling, and achieving the desired body weight through the body's reluctant compliance with insufficient intake. What has not changed is the fundamental logic. The camera, now the smartphone, the social media feed, the selfie, the constant digital image of the self in circulation, still places a premium on particular body dimensions. The industry that manages female talent, in film, in music, in the expanding universe of influencer celebrity, still applies pressure to female bodies to conform to those dimensions. The pharmaceutical industry still makes available products that serve that pressure. The surgical industry still offers interventions for the features that pharmaceuticals and diet cannot address. The starvation equation is still running. The variables have changed. The fundamental calculation has not. The camera still requires. The body still answers. And somewhere between the requirement and the answer, women still pay the invoice, in whatever currency the current technical moment accepts as payment. The women who did this in the studio era are mostly gone now. Some of them left records, in the memoirs, in the interviews, in the bodies of work that the studios produced and that we still watch. Some of them left nothing but the gap in the archive where their health records should be. What they leave us, if we are willing to receive it, is the knowledge of what the equation costs, and the question of whether, knowing what it costs, we will insist on running it anyway. That question is ours to answer. They answered theirs in the only way the system allowed. She has left the dressing room now. We do not know where she is gone. We do not know her name precisely. She is all of them, and she is none of them, and she is the space between the ones we remember and the ones we don't. She is the actress whose name appeared above the title for 7 films and then disappeared, not because she lost her talent, but because she lost the weight battle, and the studio dropped her option. She is the actress who made it to 35 films and died at 42 of what the studio press release called heart failure, and what her private physician's notes, if they had survived, might have described differently. She is the one whose memoir you read, whose candour made you uncomfortable with the discomfort of someone describing, in plain language, what is usually described in euphemism. The Starvation Equation was not an accident of history. It was not the product of ignorance, though ignorance was present. It was not the product of malice, though malice was sometimes present too. It was the product of a system that had decided what women were for and organised its institutional apparatus to produce that thing as efficiently as possible, with the least consideration for the material cost to the human beings inside the bodies the system was managing. The efficiency was impressive by the system's own standards. The films were made, the stars were thin, the cameras were satisfied, the audiences paid their money and got what they came for. What they got, without knowing it, was the manufactured product of a manufacturing process that consumed its raw material at rates the raw material could not indefinitely sustain. We are left, at the end of this, with the films themselves, the artifacts the equation produced. The black and white and technicolor images of women who were in many cases experiencing, at the precise moment the camera caught them, the effects of dietary restriction and pharmaceutical management that we would now recognize as medical crisis. The wide, bright eyes that might have been a studio photographer's dream, or might have been the dilation of amphetamine. The perfect cheekbones that might have been genetic fortune, or might have been the hollowing effect of years of insufficient nutrition. The extraordinary vitality that might have been pure talent, or might have been what talent looks like when it has learned to perform against the resistance of its own depletion. We cannot look at the films and know. We cannot see through the frame to the body behind it, the reality behind the performance. The frame is what the system was designed to produce, and the system was very good at its work. What we can do is know the equation, know what it was, know what it cost, know who paid it, and why, and what institutional forces arranged the terms. And then look at the screen. Look at whatever screen is in front of us, the silver one, the television one, the phone one, the mirror one, and decide with that knowledge in hand whether the equation is still running and what we intend to do about it. The dressing room is empty. The mirror is waiting. The camera, as it always has, is ready. What happens next is a different story, but it begins, as all the stories in this building have always begun, right here, in the space between what the camera requires and what a person, breathing and eating and alive, actually is. That space has a name. It used to be called the Starvation Equation. We are still deciding what to call it now.